Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am pleased to introduce this virtual event with Marc Bookman presenting his new book, A Descending Spiral, Exposing the Death Penalty in 12 Essays. He'll be in conversation this evening with Stephen B. Bright. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the New Press. Founded in 1992, the New Press publishes books that explore issues that affect us all. Its authors provide ideas and inspiration for the activists, teachers, policymakers, and everyday citizens who are working to defend and promote democracy. Please visit them at www.thenewpress.com or follow them on Twitter or Facebook. Thank you all for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Every week, we're hosting a slew of virtual events, and our schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After this introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to purchase Marc's book. Your purchases and your financial contributions, I'll also share a link to donate, make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past many months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Marc Bookman heads up the Atlantic Center for Capital Representation, a nonprofit that provides services for those facing possible execution. Earlier in his career, he spent many years in the homicide unit of the Defender Association of Philadelphia. Although this is his first book, you may be familiar with his work that has been published in The Atlantic, Mother Jones, Vice, and Slate, among others. Tonight, he'll be talking with Stephen Bright, a lecturer at Yale Law. He is known for his work at the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta. He's tried capital cases before juries and argued 4 cases before the Supreme Court. And both his litigation and scholarly areas of interest include capital punishment, legal representation for poor people accused of crimes, conditions and practices in prisons and jails, racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, and judicial independence. A Descending Spiral, Exposing the Death Penalty in 12 Essays, features a mix of cases that Bookman worked on and those he has researched through public records. And the book looks at the death penalty in terms of public policy, rather than through moral arguments, revealing the foibles of the system in practice. Kirkus says, in authoritative and scholarly, yet largely accessible language, Bookman evaluates a dozen cases that expose glaring injustices endemic to the system, creating a clear, comprehensive portrait of a broken system. And the cases he highlights make for fascinating reading. And Publishers Weekly raves that it's a cogent and harrowing primer on what's wrong with capital punishment. And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. And so the digital podium is yours, Marc and Stephen. Good luck.
Thank you, Claire.
Claire, thanks so much. I welcome any opportunity to talk about justice with Marc Bookman. Marc is a good friend for a long time. He's done great work as a public defender, as director of the Atlantic Center. We'll talk about that for a minute. But Claire, I want to thank you too. I spent many wonderful evenings in the bookstore and when I was in Cambridge, and remember it fondly and appreciate this opportunity to talk to Marc. As you just said, as Claire just said, this is 12 essays that Marc has written about different aspects of the death penalty, about racism, about the lawyers assigned sometimes to defend people, about the judges who judge these cases, other aspects of it. But before we talk about that, Marc, I thought maybe I would just ask you about your time as a public defender there in Philadelphia. And a lot of people might not realize how much the death penalty, how often it was sought at one time, how often it was imposed when Ron Castile, then the DA, later the Chief Justice, was there. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. Philadelphia has been a hotbed of death penalty activity for decades, really. And it started before Ron Castile. The prosecutor before Ron Castile was Ed Rendell, later Philadelphia's mayor and governor. And then after Ron Castile was Lynn Abraham, a pretty legendary prosecutor for seeking the death penalty. New York Times said she was America's deadliest DA at the time. So when I got into the homicide unit, I was in the first homicide unit for years. Philadelphia did not let the public defenders handle homicides for kind of political reasons. Once we started in the defender homicide unit, we were only doing 20% of the cases, and I'd say 70% of the cases, the Commonwealth, the Philadelphia District Attorney would at least seek the death penalty. So it was trial by fire right from the very beginning.
And before your office got involved in it, I remember that the Philadelphia Inquirer did an expose about how they said people in these death penalty cases, that the people in the court system wouldn't want to be represented by the lawyers that were being assigned in traffic court, that the lawyers were so bad. And it was a real expose of just terrible legal representation of people facing the death penalty in a big major city.
Yeah, our good friend Rick Tolsky, who I know you know as well. Rick is the one that wrote this expose. I think he won a Pulitzer Prize for it, and frankly, it embarrassed the city of Philadelphia to such an extent that they felt like they had to let the public defender at least take some of these cases. Ordinarily, the public defender's office handles about 70% of cases across the board, but here we've only been able to handle 20%, and that limit is to this day only 20%. But I think the city felt like it had no choice. It was a national embarrassment. It was basically a revolving door of injustice in Philadelphia.
And I think since your office became involved in 1993, is that right, and started handling every fifth case, whatever, 20% of the cases, and never a single client represented by the Defender Association has been sentenced to death. Yeah,
knock on wood, that is still the case. And I have to say, it's important, I think, for everyone to understand the Defender Association never took a death sentence. It's not because all of us in the defender office were such hotshot lawyers. What that showed, I think, was that competent, well-trained, well-resourced lawyers could basically get rid of the death penalty. And so I think that's what it shows. It's not like we were going to trial and winning case after case. That's not the way it happened. I would describe it much more similar to the recent experience in Virginia, which I know you're familiar with.
I was just going to say, what you did in Philadelphia, the capital defenders did in Virginia, and basically shut down the death penalty for 10 years until finally Virginia abolished the death penalty or repealed its death penalty statute earlier this year.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, the Virginia Capital Regional offices essentially turned the death penalty into a dinosaur. There was no point in paying the money anymore since there were no death sentences. And that really proves the point. If we just resource competent lawyers and train them, the death penalty becomes a real rarity.
And let me take just a minute, Tucker, ask you to talk a minute about the Atlantic Center.
So, Pennsylvania, shamefully, is the only state that doesn't contribute any money for indigent defense. Every county fends for itself, and there's 67 counties in Pennsylvania. So, that encourages counties to cut corners and do it on the cheap. And that's how Pennsylvania has always handled the death penalty. So the Atlantic Center is a resource. It's really a resource center for people facing the death penalty, either pre-trial or after they've received a death sentence. We try to help in any way we can by offering training to lawyers across the state. And We consult in almost all the cases that we can consult on, and then we do some individual representation as well. So we're basically a small nonprofit trying to keep a finger in the dam, essentially.
Well, let's turn to the book. I mean, it's a marvelous book, and all 12 of the chapters in the book are fascinating. I thought one case I might ask you to talk about to begin with, because it deals with both the mental health issues, which is just a striking thing that we learn about in the book, as well as the race issues, is Andre Thomas's case. This is a case out of Texas.
There's so much to talk about in that case, Steve. You almost don't know where to begin. The facts themselves are horrific, but also incredibly emblematic of severe mental illness. Mr. Thomas killed 3 people. He used 3 separate knives. He took their organs home in his pockets. I mean, a profoundly, seriously mentally ill man, and frankly, a man who, I think reasonable people could say, this was a very dangerous and awful crime, but he's so mentally ill that we shouldn't seek the death penalty against him. So there's the mental health aspect of that case. Just to give the audience, I mean, you have to almost be seated to hear these facts. Shortly after the crime, he removed one of his eyes, based on a biblical, a biblical phrase, and then after he received the death penalty some years later, he blinded himself by removing his other eye, and so we're talking about severe, profound mental illness. But then layer onto that the unbelievable racism of this case. Again, I don't know where to start, but I do know where to end. On the jury that convicted him, Andre Thomas is a black man. He killed his white wife, wife that he was separated from, and 2 children, both mixed race children, and 3 members of the jury who sat and rendered judgment on this case said in their questionnaires that they were against mixed marriage. Such an outrageous declaration that this case has Andre Thomas is still facing execution. The Fifth Circuit recently affirmed his case, even knowing that these 3 jurors sat. And what's remarkable to me is that the dissent had to cite the case of Loving versus Virginia, which basically legalized a mixed marriage. I don't know how long ago that case was, 45 years ago, something along. So the idea that a judge still has to cite a case like Loving versus Virginia, in a capital case, really remarkable, I think.
Well, and of course, the disturbing thing about it is even after he had gouged out his eye and pretty much left no doubt whatsoever about how profoundly mentally ill he was, the system just cranked right on without finding that maybe this person was so disabled or so impaired that maybe the death penalty was not appropriate.
Yeah, it was. It's in so many cases we see the prosecutors being overly aggressive, sometimes in terms of even of misconduct, and at the same time we see kind of an inept defense opposition. In this case, they really didn't. They didn't produce what we call mitigating evidence, the evidence that would have led a reasonable juror to say he's not the worst of the worst. He's just too mentally ill to give a death sentence to. And the lawyers did not do that. They did not challenge his competency for trial. Clearly, very, very incompetent man. So, it's that combination. And then after putting these 3 jurors on the jury who were against mixed marriage, the prosecutor gets up at the end of the trial and talks about the white witnesses who testified on Andre Thomas's behalf, and the prosecutor basically said, would you want your daughter or granddaughter dating Mr. Thomas? Kind of an overt cry to racism, very much like a case that you argued in front of the Supreme Court, Steve, on the prosecutor that identified the case with the O.J. Simpson case, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Very similar. Yeah.
Right. Well, you talk about a lot of lawyering in the book. One other sort of lawyer I thought maybe we talk a little bit about is Andy Prince, who tried. There's some real sad cases in this book. There's some tragic cases like Robert Holsley, one we're going to talk about, ended up with a death sentence. There are some people who were innocent. We'll get to those in a minute. But when we're talking about people not having adequate lawyers, Robert Holsley's case is a deeply disturbing case.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I start the essay by asking how many people know just how much a quart of vodka is, because you tend not to measure alcohol in that way by quarts. This man, Andy Prince, whose life was falling apart all around him, was drinking a quart of vodka a night during the capital trial. It's a miracle that he even found his way to court, frankly. And yet he's drinking a quart of vodka a night. A man's life, Robert Holsley's life, is in his hands. And, he did a predictably awful job. There's no other way around it.
One would think he might have been drinking because he was under so much pressure in the case. But as you said, he had a lot of other things. His life was falling apart. He was about to be indicted and disbarred for stealing client funds. And ultimately he was disbarred and indicted.
So, what's particularly interesting about that case, and Steve, I'm going to implicate you again in this, because there's a part, after Mr. Holsey goes to death row, lawyers go and speak to the jurors, and the jurors are instructed not only you don't have to talk to the defense lawyers, but you shouldn't talk to them, which I think is really improper. Anyway, one of the jurors felt that it was in fact improper, and he goes, and so he speaks to the defense. And what he says is fascinating to me. He says he was on a prior jury by coincidence. This is a Georgia case. It was one of your juries. And he says that in your case, there was a lot of mitigating evidence that was presented. And that made it clear to him that your client, Mr. Brooks, was not one of the worst. But then he went and sat as a juror in the Holsey case, didn't see that evidence, that Mr. Prince did not present that evidence. And so this juror was left to the conclusion that Holsey must be the worst of the worst because that evidence wasn't presented. So, in an ironic way, great lawyering led to that death sentence because Prince didn't produce the evidence that you guys had produced in that earlier case. Very, very sad outcome.
Very sad case. And the trial judge in Georgia said this lawyer couldn't possibly have tried this case correctly. And he found that Holsey ought to get a new trial, but that was reversed on appeal. And then in the federal courts, as I recall, it was a 2-1 decision. And Judge Barquette, in dissenting, pointed out that Holsey was intellectually limited and that his house, that the abuse and the mistreatment of the children in the house that he grew up in was so bad that the neighbors called the house the torture chamber. And yet the jury didn't hear any of that evidence. And Robert Holsey was executed. That's the case that, and Andre Thomas is only one step away from execution. He just got lost his case in the Court of Appeals.
The amazing thing about these cases, and I found this every time I started to write an essay, there's always more injustice than you start out thinking. You look at Holsey's case and you might think it's just about a lawyer who was drinking a quart of vodka a night. I say just, that's ordinarily enough. But what goes unfounded by that lawyer is what you just said. Every one of these cases, compounds its injustice. And the one thing that I think is really important for people to understand is, and I say this at the very end of the book, this is the tip of the iceberg. It's not that these cases are the incredible rarities and the average cases being handled properly. These cases are typical. They're average. They're not the unusual case. It's very important for people to keep that in mind, I think. Hard to believe.
One other lawyer you wrote about that I know quite well, or knew quite well, Johnny Mosteller, who also had a client sentenced to death and also had a client executed.
Yeah. And, Mosteller, I mean, well-known lawyer in Georgia. He's the case is about a racist juror who says he uses the N-word when he's explaining why he returned a death sentence. A pretty outrageous, racist comment, obviously. But as it turns out, Mosteller, the lawyer for Mr. Foltz, the man who was executed, he's a racist also, and everybody knows he's a racist. And so, there are quotes in the essay from lawyers who are listening to Mosteller kind of shoot his mouth off, and in a very racist way. And then there are clients of Mosteller's who come forward and say that Mosteller, used racist language towards them as well. So, it's circle after circle. I mean, it's like peeling an onion. You never get to the bottom of it. And, Mosteller, as I understand it, was a man who attracted attention to himself, drove a fancy, crazy car with a big horns in the front, just a guy who was looking for attention every minute, but really should have been practicing.
It was a very colorful character. He dressed sort of like a cowboy, wore a big cowboy hat. He had a handlebar mustache, and you never forgot him once you had seen him. But he was very flamboyant, but sort of flamboyantly terrible. He handled a huge amount of cases. He handled more cases than any lawyer could ever handle. And just a couple of weeks ago, the federal court in Atlanta set aside the death penalty case. One of his other clients. I mean, just fortunately, this case, the court saw it a little bit differently, and Willie Pye, and kept him from being executed.
Yeah. And, and again, the racism in this case with the lawyer, with the juror, really, if there's one thing that permeates the book, it's the kind of endemic racism in the criminal justice system. And again, Steve, I quote you in there somewhere that the last place the civil rights movement has reached is our courtrooms, our criminal justice courtrooms. Every case has some aspect of racism to it almost.
I guess I might, while we're talking about that, ask you about the judge in Texas, Vickers Cunningham, who presided over a case, so-called Texas 7. And most of those people were executed, but one was not.
Yeah, a couple actually are still alive, and one of them is Randy Halpern, who I do write about. Halpern is Jewish, and Judge Cunningham, no longer Judge Cunningham, thankfully, was overtly anti-Semitic, also overtly racist, and overtly homophobic. He put his money in a trust for his kids. They only got the money if they married opposite sex, same race, and same religion. I think I got that right. I mean, right. A pretty overtly racist guy, and so Cunningham is presiding over this case with the Jewish man, Halpern, and he's saying all sorts of anti-Semitic stuff. And the painful part of this story is that everybody surrounding him knew that he was a racist. They knew he was an anti-Semite. He didn't make any bones about it. He's a classic white supremacist, and nobody says a word. So it doesn't come out until he's running for office, and I guess it's his brother who kind of leaks the story because they don't want him elected to this commissioner's job. But meanwhile, for years, he's presiding over cases and his clerks, his secretary, his family, no one's saying a word. Very disheartening.
Right, right. Well, I'd like to ask you about another prosecutor who became judge, Ron Castillo, and the Williams case, Terry Williams. That's a fascinating case, took place over a long period of time.
Well, Terry's case, again, these cases never just have one aspect to them. For starters, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is seeking the death penalty against him. Terry commits 2 accused murders. I'll say accused because I want to explain why in a minute. He's accused of 2 murders, one when he's 17, the second when he's just 18. So, but in both cases, he was sexually abused since around the age of 13 by these middle-aged men. And so you'd think just there, you wouldn't seek the death penalty. He's very young, barely eligible for death, victimized by the victims in his cases. So the first case, the sexual abuse comes out in a limited way, and the jury comes back 3rd-degree murder, not 1st-degree murder. So he's not eligible for death. In the second case, the prosecutor has basically learned her lesson. She realizes that the sexual aspect of the case will not allow for a death verdict. So she, in my opinion, she denies this, but in my opinion, she hides evidence of the sexual abuse. The lawyer is just meeting Terry for the first time a day or 2 before. So now you've got prosecutor misconduct, you've got a lawyer, lawyer ineptitude, for lack of a better word, and it's only decades later that it's revealed that the second victim was also a sexual abuser of Terry Williams. The evidence comes out, and the matter is stayed. The execution is put off. But Ron Castillo, who is he's the DA at the time these decisions are being made initially. He's the head DA initially. The case goes to the United States Supreme Court because the claim is Castillo cannot be presiding as a Supreme Court Chief Justice over a case that he was also the prosecutor on, not the actual prosecutor, but the head prosecutor. Goes to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court says, wait 1 second. This is a conflict. You can't be a prosecutor and a judge. So Terry Williams gets a reprieve. The 3rd-degree case gets dismissed. That's a whole story in itself because of prosecutorial misconduct, basically. And then he's now fighting this second case for which he's serving a life sentence right now. So that's just an ongoing saga. And it's just, again, it's a combination of overly aggressive prosecution, inept defense, and judges that are either looking the other way or just staying out of it entirely.
And just to be clear on that, Castillo was the chief district attorney. He was the district attorney. He approved seeking the death penalty. He had to give the go-ahead for that.
That's exactly right.
Later, he was the chief justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and he's still deciding that case, even though he had made a critical decision.
And what just add to this, that we have elections in Pennsylvania for the Supreme Court and all judges, and he ran for the Supreme Court advertising that he had obtained 45 death sentences as the head prosecutor in Philadelphia. So he basically ran with that as a platform on his ticket. So the Supreme Court said that was a bridge too far.
I would like for you to talk about some of these innocence cases that you cover in the book. One, some of them are not very happy ending cases because people spend a lot of time in prison for crimes they didn't do, a lot of time on death row for crimes they didn't do. And one that struck me particularly, you describe a case where they had 4 people all guilty of a crime that was only committed by 2 people. So they had to deal with that in some way. They had convicted these 2 people. They had been under death sentence for a long period of time, and then they found 2 other people who were actually the people who committed the crime.
So this is a kind of a fascinating case. First, let me just say this, Steve. We don't have too many happy stories in our world, right?
Right.
I mean,
right.
even in the best of all cases, someone, ends up getting out of prison after a long period of time. In this case, these 2 guys that get convicted both confess. They both confess to a detective, and then one of them takes a long sentence and then testifies against the other one. But then 20 years later, it turns out that they're both innocent. And the reason we know this is because my client comes along. My client is now deceased, but my client comes along and they pick him up on a cold case because his fingerprint matches a murder. He then confesses to a whole bunch of other murders, and one of them is this case. And so an investigation occurs, and everybody understands that these 2 people are innocent. But think about what the death penalty did there. They were both scared of getting the death penalty, and they both confessed to a crime they didn't commit. And then one of them actually testified. And both of them, both men, low functioning. One almost certainly intellectually disabled. The other one just plainly low functioning, and all because they were scared about a possible death sentence. That's
something I think people, just have a hard time understanding, is that somebody, in this case, not only confessed to a crime they didn't commit, we know that clearly because somebody else committed, but they pled guilty to a crime they didn't commit, and then testified that the other fellow, their friend, actually had committed.
Yeah. I think false confessions is such a counterintuitive part of our world. You ask people, and they will tell you that they believe in false confessions, but they also will tell you they would never do it themselves. They would never confess falsely to an awful crime, and yet we know it happens all the time. I mean, the Central Park Five. There's many cases where people have confessed under horrible coercion, or at least the police claim they confessed, and it turns out because of DNA or something else that they were clearly innocent. I mean, it's a remarkable kind of psychological effect, and the death penalty plays a big role in that. When people are scared that things might be worse.
And you tell some other stories, including the one about the immigrant in Florida who was convicted and sentenced to death, and now still is under some question of whether he's going to be removed or not, right?
Yeah, Mr. Clemente Aguirre, he found himself in a very difficult situation, and the reason he didn't explain, he walked into this crime scene. He basically walked into a crime scene, and then left his DNA, to some, well, his footprints and so forth at the crime scene. Was afraid to explain why, because he feared he would be deported. And then, of course, ended up getting a death sentence and many years in prison. And the evidence that he was innocent kind of, it's like Hemingway said about bankruptcy. It happened slowly and then quickly, something like that. I'm probably misquoting Hemingway at this point, but that's what happened in this case. The evidence started to become more and more clear. And then at some point, it was just an avalanche of evidence that was innocent. And yet the prosecutor still couldn't bring himself to admit that mistakes had been made, as they say. And
Right.
There was a very aggressive judge who didn't want to hear it. She had her own troubles because she kept, obsessively getting speeding tickets. It's a crazy world out there, and some people just shouldn't be handling capital punishment cases.
Well, that's a fascinating case. And I think people enjoy reading that chapter and seeing how all that, how that went wrong so badly. And then fortunately for him, that things sort of came together. One case that didn't end so well is the woman who was sentenced to death, Brenda Andrew in Oklahoma. And you sort of deal there with what the prosecution did to maybe overcome any reluctance. The jury had to sentence her to death.
Yeah, you know, I want to read what that judge, what a judge on the Oklahoma Supreme Court said. She's still on death row in Oklahoma, the only woman on death row in Oklahoma. And the essay is called Sex Shamed to Death. And that's the prosecutor spent most of his time kind of sex shaming Brenda Andrew. It was not so much about the crime as about her behavior. And so one of the Oklahoma Supreme Court justices said this: in light of my experience, I'm sorry, I got the wrong page here. Let me get to the right one. The first stage of this capital murder trial is rife with error. That error, at its most egregious, includes a pattern of introducing evidence that has no purpose other than to hammer home that Brenda Andrew is a bad wife, a bad mother, and a bad woman. The jury was allowed to consider such evidence in violation of the fundamental rule that a defendant must be convicted, if at all, of the crime charged and not of being a bad woman. In this case, you know, the prosecutor spent his whole time just talking about her what he perceived as her moral shortcomings. And that's really what put her on death row in a case that ordinarily, you know, wouldn't merit that.
Right.
Yeah.
Very last chapter, Smoke. A little different than the other chapters.
Yes, it's the only autobiographical. You know, I wrote a lot of short stories before I started writing these essays, and you know, when I look at all of them, this is the only autobiographical piece I ever wrote. So it is very different because I'm really out of all of the other essays. You know, either because I had no role whatsoever, or that my role wasn't prominent to the story. This is the one autobiographical piece.
And what were you telling in that chapter?
Well, you know, I just wanted to give the reader a sense of what kind of being a capital, what being a death penalty lawyer really is all about. And the most important thing I wanted to kind of get across is the idea that these cases happen in teams, not individually. There really is no individual in these cases. The cases, as I understand them at the highest level, are all practiced in teams. And so I wanted to lay out, you know, the kind of roller coaster that a capital case can be for, you know, a competent defense team. And it was an interesting one for me to write because that case, you know, I've lost a lot of hair in my day, and that case certainly didn't help any, I'll put it that way.
Very good. You talk about a lot of times here, two people and how the cases come out differently and all that. A couple of cases in Florida that you write about, John Ferguson and Buford White. Buford White, actually, the jury unanimously, this is people will just, their heads will shake when they read this. The jury unanimously sentenced him to life in prison, but he got executed by Florida.
Yeah, pretty amazing. So you know, that case is fascinating for any number of reasons. One, that a man who got a 12-0 vote for life was executed. He was also executed 30 years before a much more guilty person in the same case got executed because of his mental illness and so forth. So Buford White, who you know, he got a 12-0 vote for life, and rightly so, because he really was not involved in the murders. It was an awful murder case, but he wasn't really involved. So the jury voted 12-0 for life. Unfortunately, Mr. White ran into, you know, one of the worst judges, you know, of all time from our perspective, a judge named Fuller, who overrode the jury's intent, and he was executed shortly after in the 1980s. It was, like I said, 30 years later that one of his co-defendants, who was much more involved in the murder, got executed, lived 30 years longer.
And of course, Florida and Alabama both had people could be sentenced to death, even if the jury didn't give them the death penalty. That's changed now, but there's still, you're right, there are a number of people still on death row who had jury sentences of life in prison, but the judges overrode and gave the death penalty.
Yes, and that issue has come before the United States Supreme Court a few times, but they have not stepped in to address it. So that the idea that judges can still make these decisions, that's still on the book. It hasn't changed, even though there was a chance to.
Well, as you mentioned a moment ago, that's sort of the luck of the draw, what judge you might happen to have, whether it's the judge who does the sentencing in this case, or as you were talking about in Clemente's case a moment ago, the judge who has the case later on and is trying to, when the evidence of innocence is being presented.
Yeah, I think there's probably a something I don't have to tell you, but a lot of people might think that the judge is just sitting up there, minding his or her own business. But oftentimes nothing could be further from the truth. And the decisions judges make are really influential in the way a case turns out, either pretrial or post-conviction.
Well, I want to ask people in the time we have left, if they have questions, we will be glad to answer them. Mark will be glad to answer them. So please type up your questions. Someone has written, I've heard that as many as a quarter of the people on death row are innocent. What's is the truth in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's this kind of myth among death penalty advocates that the system actually works. That when we find an innocent client, even after he's done decades in prison, that shows that the system was working, which of course on its face is absurd. We've certainly caught enough innocent clients, before execution, so that you have to conclude that some innocent people have been executed. It would be non-mathematical to think otherwise. I can't give the question or a number as to how many innocent people there are, and I also would like to point out that innocence, can be defined in a lot of different ways. There is the innocence of someone who had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. They were, in Poughkeepsie at the time. Well, that's one kind of innocence. But there's also innocence of not being guilty of the highest crime possible. And there's also innocence of not deserving the death penalty, but getting the death penalty. So I can't quantify the number of truly innocent people, but there's enough innocent people in those three categories to make us stop and think that this is just a failed government program.
This is a very good question. I just graduated from law school, someone writes, and will be working on capital cases in Florida. How have you managed to stay in this field for so long? And do you have any advice about avoiding burnout?
Yeah, I always tell people that this job, if it is right for you, is the greatest job in the world. I never once looked at the clock on a working day and wished it was later. Never. Like I always wanted it to be a little earlier so you could get more done. So the job itself is phenomenal if it's right for you. But if it's not right for you, there's so much other good work out there. There's discrimination work, and there's landlord tenant work, and there's just a million types of union work, and just a million types of good things people could do. Burnout was never a problem for me because I love the work. It's huge stress and nerves, but not burnout. I think if you just respect your clients and recognize the human frailty that's involved for all of us, then burnout is not a problem. But I will also say this, for years, I was encouraging young lawyers to go into another field because I was so optimistic that we would be done with the death penalty. I was naively optimistic about it. And it's only recently, with some recent disappointing elections, 2016 in particular, that lead me to think we need a new generation of people to come along and kind of close the door on this kind of outrageous policy. So that's the best I can tell you.
Another question, so many of these problems seem to happen in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. Why is that? Of course, you've also told about Oklahoma, Georgia, Texas, several Texas cases.
But I'm not going to lie, Philadelphia is like a petri dish for misconduct to some extent. Like there's a reason for it. The reason is that Philadelphia never took the death penalty seriously. So they paid a minuscule amount of money to untrained and unresourced court-appointed lawyers. And then we had this series of overly aggressive prosecutors. And so, you combine that and you've got death sentence after death sentence. And then each one of them gets overturned because of the bad lawyer and because of the overly aggressive prosecution. And I keep saying overly aggressive. Prosecutorial misconduct. We should just say what it is. There was a study done, an interesting Rand study that it looked at the cases handled by the Philadelphia public defender from 1994 to 2005. They took the 20% of the defender cases and the 80% of the court-appointed cases, and there were a lot of cases. They looked at the results, and it turned out that if you were represented by a defender, you were 61% less likely to be convicted of first-degree murder. You were 19% more, 16 or 19% more likely to be acquitted, and overall your sentence was 24% less. And that really burst the bubble, because I think we'd like to think that lawyering shouldn't really matter. At that level, the case should speak for itself one way or the other. But in fact, lawyering matters a huge amount. And that's dispiriting. And what it really shows is that we have to fund quality lawyering like Virginia did. We have to do that in order to avoid the injustice that we see over and over and over again in Philadelphia and other places.
And I might just add one thing about Pennsylvania. I think Pennsylvania is still the only state where all of the funding of lawyers for poor people accused of crimes is up to the counties. So there's no state-funded public defender system like in Colorado, for example. You have a very well-funded public defender, New Jersey, other states, very well-funded, and a capital. We talked about Virginia a few moments ago. In Virginia, where there are regional capital defender offices, so that people didn't get this kind of terrible representation that we've been talking about. Of course, those offices are out of business now because Virginia no longer has the death penalty. Another person asked, why is the book titled A Descending Spiral?
So a descending spiral are words from a famous quote by Martin Luther King. And I don't want to misquote it. It's at the very beginning of the book. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. So, for me, those words are obviously very, very powerful. And that's the way I see the death penalty. I see capital punishment as a descending spiral. We're trying to get rid of violence, and all we're doing is creating more violence. It's not a working policy.
Another question is, what can people without law degrees how can they get involved, and what can they do? Well,
so, the truth is, there's a lot of answers to that question. Not everybody on the team, I was talking about how important teams are in capital defense, and not everyone on the team is a lawyer, thank God, frankly. Mitigation specialists, the ones that are doing that are doing the investigation into a person's background, so that information can get presented to a jury. That's an incredibly important aspect to the team, and there are paralegals and there are investigators. So in that regard, you know, the whole team is not just lawyers. But aside from that, you know, for me, I think the biggest problem with the death penalty is that there are still politicians and still prosecutors who think that this is more popular policy than it is. It's not. When you ask people about the death penalty, the polls usually show that the polls are low, but they usually show 55% or so people favor the death penalty. That's the wrong question. The right question is, what do you prefer after you've convicted someone of first-degree murder, which is how you become eligible for the death penalty? Do you prefer a death sentence, or do you prefer life without parole with restitution to the victims? And when you ask that question, the majority of people don't favor the death penalty. They favor a sentence of life without parole or life with parole. So, you know, the best thing we can do is persuade our politicians and our prosecutors that the death penalty doesn't have the cachet that it used to have, that you're not going to lose votes if you are opposed to the death penalty. That to me is the most important thing we can get across.
And just one thing to put the death penalty in perspective, in the mid-1990s, we had as many as 300 people being sentenced to death in courts all across the country. In the last few years, it's been less than 40. So there's been an incredible decline in the number of death sentences being imposed. And at one time, there were 38 states that had the death penalty, and now it's down to 27. So we've seen more and more states, Virginia, Colorado, New Hampshire, other states that have repealed their death penalty laws. But with regard to your last comment, I'd follow up asking this. Philadelphia is one place where we've had a progressive prosecutor elected, Larry Krasner. This has happened in other places around the country. And what is your perspective on what the impact of that has been on criminal justice in general and the death penalty in particular?
So Larry Krasner, who by coincidence is facing a primary today in the challenge, you know, he said something that I really love. He said he got tired of lighting money on fire. That's the way he saw the death penalty. We haven't, you know, in Pennsylvania, we haven't had an involuntary execution. By that involuntary, we executed 3 people who wanted to be executed in the 1990s. We haven't had an involuntary execution since 1962. So Krasner said, you know, why are we throwing away money on this? You know, we're getting nothing for it at all, except injustice, I think. And so he basically stopped the death penalty in Philadelphia. And he's got a real conviction integrity unit. That unit has done phenomenal work in getting people out of prison who are innocent, and also people who are just, you know, unfairly sentenced to way longer than they should be. We have a lieutenant governor who's pushing hard for commutations, John Fetterman, who's now running for senator. So Krasner's done a world of good, I think. But like any reformer who is bringing about major change, you know, there was an establishment pushback. I'm not a Star Wars fan, but I was saying to you earlier, it's, you know, the Empire Strikes Back. So Krasner is doing his best. You know, Philadelphia came from a place where we were regressive for years and years and years. And then a progressive person came in. So it wasn't a steady line of progress. Krasner came in and shook up the equation. And so there's a pushback, but I think he's really standing his ground. And we're all very, very proud of the job he's done.
Mark, are there other things you'd like as we wrap up here just to say with regard to the book or with regard to the issue of the death penalty?
You know, I mean, I'm really optimistic about the end of the death penalty. It's just, you know, we've kept our head in the sands, but you pointed out, Steve, it's not just that death sentences are going down, executions are dramatically going down as well. Right. We went from 99 to, I don't know how many I mean, this year was a pandemic year, but even before that, we're under 40. So, all signs indicate a decrease. And I think that, people might point to the 70s where the 60s, we were against the death penalty, and then public opinion changed. I think what's different now is that, and Thurgood Marshall was talking about how uninformed people were back then. We're more informed now because of situations like this, and hundreds and hundreds of forums. We know now about human frailty because of DNA. We know about false confessions. We know about mistakes. We know a lot more about prosecutorial misconduct, and we know a lot more about bad lawyering. So, all those things together add up to jurors who are more informed, and even prosecutors who are more informed. So, I'm optimistic in that regard, and I think we are seeing the end of it. As for the book, it's important. I want to say this again. These cases are not isolated. They're typical. That's what, if the reader comes away with anything at all, I didn't write about the O.J. Simpson case or the Scott Peterson case or some high profile cases. I really kind of studiously avoided those high profile cases because I think the real point here is that these are the typical cases. And if we're going to have this kind of a policy, this is the consequence to that. The only other thing I want to say is it sounds like our job is so grim. There's some humor to our job. We're able to see hope and joy when things do get rectified, and strength, and so it's not all grim horror. It's a great job, and I'd like to see the end of it. The Atlantic Center's slogan is trying to put ourselves out of business since 2010, and that's what I'd really like to see. I guess I should also plug our website, atlanticcenter.org. If people are really interested, we would love to have you. We'd love you to visit, and we are supported by the kindness of strangers, as Tennessee Williams would say.
And this book is extraordinarily valuable to telling people about the cases like Mark just said, not the ones that have been in the news, not the ones that we all know about, but about what's happening in and day out in trial courts all over the country, and appellate courts, what prosecutors are doing, what kind of lawyers people are getting that are accused of crimes, where the process breaks down, the enormity of taking a human being's life. You can never put back once a person has been executed. And we've got people in Texas like Todd Willingham and Carlos Hernandez and other people where they're pretty clear innocent people have been put to death. And when you look at things like the mental illness and other issues that are covered so well in this book, I think it gives one a real broad perspective on the death penalty and raises all the important issues with regard to it. So Mark, thank you. And thank all of you for joining us tonight. And thanks to the Harvard Bookstore for having us.
And thank you, Steve, not only for tonight, but for all the work you've done for decades. You're a real icon in our community, and I didn't really get much of a chance to say that. I actually put Steve's name in the acknowledgments. He's just been a real role model to many of us. So we appreciate having you tonight.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both for being here tonight and having this important conversation with us at Harvard Bookstore. And thank you particularly for your kind words about the bookstore. I'd also like to take a moment to thank everyone out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about this book and purchase it on our website or via the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night. Keep reading and be well, everyone. Thanks.